Well, hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are in the country. My name is Garrett Schmidt. I am the CEO and managing editor for BBC Exhibit Hall. And I'd like to welcome you all to today's live webinar hosted by DataGen. And it is titled Mandatory CMS Team Using Simulated Episodes of Care to Evaluate Risk and Opportunity. So very excited about the topic. We've got a lot to cover, so we will get into it here shortly. Few items of note, though. Everyone has entered today in listen-only mode, so you don't need to worry about turning off your camera or your microphone. All that's been done for you. But we do want to hear from you. We are going to have a time for some Q&A towards the end of the presentation. So if you have a question for either of our speakers anytime during the presentation, you can drop your question in the module there. There's a place specifically for questions, and we're going to get to as many as we can. Again, we have a lot to cover, so we may run out of time, but if we do, don't worry. Someone will reach out and make sure they answer your question for you. So even if we're wrapping up and running out of time, go ahead and ask your question anyway. We'll get to it. And the other thing is the session today is being recorded, so you will receive an email when we conclude, maybe about an hour or so afterwards, and there'll be a link to the recording and also to where you can download the slides from today's presentation. So if you want to rewatch it, share it with colleagues, we hope that you do. That's something we certainly want to get the message out. And without further ado, I would like to very briefly introduce our speakers today. We have with us Mr. John Calamares, and he is the Director of Business Intelligence Analytics with DataGen. And then we also have with us Miss Alyssa Dahl, and she is the Vice President of Advanced Analytics. So I wanted to welcome you two.
Great. Thank you, Garrett. We're very excited to be here speaking on this webinar today. And as Garrett mentioned, we do have quite a lot of material that we're planning to cover. This is actually a pretty fun webinar for us in that it's going to be a really data-heavy discussion, which, John and I are both analysts by background, so we're really excited to do this and have this type of session. These are some of the learning objectives that we've posed for this session. We're going to talk a lot about the transforming episode accountability model, what simulated episodes of care are. Sometimes you also hear those referred to as shadow bundles. And then we're going to look at each episode category, look at those market trends, and talk about what are the really important levers that matter for hospitals that are going at risk in these models. So just a little bit of background about DataGen. We were founded over 25 years ago, and we're actually a subsidiary of the Healthcare Association of New York State. The work we do falls under a lot of different topics. We have applications for things like supporting the culture of safety survey, litigation trackers, community health needs assessments. But one of the areas that we have most of our expertise is actually with our work on Medicare claims data. So we do impact reports for just about every hospital and Part A facility in the country, looking at those prospective payment system impacts over time as the Medicare program continues to evolve. And then really more focused on our webinar today is our history with Medicare alternative payment models. And if you look at the image on this screen, this really just gives you a sense of the variety of models that we've worked on over the last 13 years with various at-risk entities, whether they've been hospitals, state-based programs, primary care practices that were doing those types of transformation models, accountable care organizations. So we look at it as it's almost like you're always experiencing a different flavor of what that methodology has to offer and what makes these programs both similar and different. But really, as an organization right now, one of the things that's our primary focus and concern is looking at the TEAM model, because it is not only one of the newest models to come out of Medicare, but also because of its mandatory nature. In this work that we do, helping providers that are at risk in Medicare alternative payment models spans across the country. You could take a look at this map for our footprint. What we think's unique about our approach in DataGen really comes down to a couple of things. Being a subsidiary of a hospital association gives us deep roots in understanding Medicare payment policy and that modeling impact of how the program changes across the various prospective payment systems. We spend a lot of time replicating and verifying methodologies by CMS, and we are often bringing forward inconsistencies and errors needing resolution. We also will propose comments that various industry stakeholders will take into account in their letters. And a lot of these models also require that initial education and also continuous learning throughout implementation as we uncover new trends and also what's working and what's not working for the institutions that we're working with. So while this webinar is going to be focusing on team, I would say this is not your average team webinar. So in fact, we're not going through any of the mechanics related to team. Hopefully most of the people attending today have some level of familiarity, and on my next slide, I'll just go through a couple of the basics, but what we're really looking forward to doing is what I term nerding out a little bit with the data, going through those market trends and talking about the levers that matter for the hospitals that will be at risk in these programs. So if you look at this table, just to bring anybody up to speed that hasn't been closely following TEAM, these are the highlights of what TEAM will include. It will be a 5-year model. It will actually start on January 1st of 2026. The at-risk entities will be acute care hospitals. This program is mandatory in nature. The hospitals chosen were based on CBSAs that CMS selected through a stratified random sampling methodology. There was also a voluntary one-time opt-in that was made available for hospitals that were participating in CJR through the end or BPCI Advanced Model Year 7, which is still happening right now. That date has since passed, but those hospitals needed to submit a letter to CMS by January 31st to get into the program. When we're talking about TEAM, we're only talking about your Medicare fee-for-service beneficiaries. They have to have Part A and B coverage. We're talking about 30-day episodes of care, and it's for 5 very common surgical procedures. So lower extremity joint replacements, surgical hip femur fracture treatment, coronary artery bypass graft procedures, major bowel procedure, and also spinal fusions. But when John gets into showing some of the analytics, you'll see that the bulk of these episodes, it's really dominated by those ortho episodes, which carry the highest volume in the program. And as is standard for really any bundled payment or alternative payment model, there is a discount factor that gets applied for these episodes in the target price structure. This ensures a certain amount of savings to the Medicare program, and there is quality that is linked to performance, and that's really a standard of all advanced alternative payment models at this point. So for hospitals going into TEAM, you can see there are a lot of strategies to prepare. I haven't listed probably everything that there is, but this just gives you a bit of a sampling of the things that hospitals are going through. And I'm sure many of you on the call today are from hospitals, and this is part of what you're experiencing right now. Thinking about who are going to be the leaders for your program, assembling that multidisciplinary team that's going to form your governance committee and is really going to be responsible for how your hospital progresses through this model. What things do you want to change? What infrastructure do you need? How will we respond to some of the technical and analytic challenges, and also provide feedback to not only the clinicians that are participating in this model, but also the leadership in your organization about how it's going. But where we're going to be spending most of our time is really on this, how do we conduct data analysis aspect of the program? And a lot of the analytics that we can do right now before the program even goes live will continue to be important throughout the duration of the model, but really help organizations get that bit of level setting for what are the things that we need to look for when we're evaluating our episodes and determining, what type of resources do we put on this program and how do we move forward and evolve so that we can stay whole and do a good job in this program. So if we're thinking about how do we prepare for data in TEAM, this is just a little bit of a timeline of where we are right now. So it's about 9 months until the model is going to go live. We know that there's some rulemaking that still has to happen for CMS to finalize some aspects of TEAM. Hopefully we see some of that in the inpatient proposed rule that comes out next month. And hospitals can anticipate seeing baseline data really towards the end of this year, sometime in Q4, it will become available. But one of the really valuable types of things that hospitals can do right now before that baseline data becomes available is they can look at what's called a simulated episode of care or even a shadow bundle as a means of looking at performance and utilization within that unit of a disease specific episode of care or bundle structure. Um, that is really a valuable way to start getting a feel for what are the things that your organization can do to achieve savings or improve care or really get a handle on the team model and beginning to have that transparency with the different people in your organization that are going to need to be involved. So before we get into the types of data, we do have a polling question that Garrett's going to help walk us through.
All right, so you should see this on your screen. And this is what type of data are you primarily using to assess the new CMS team model? This is anonymous, by the way, so feel free to participate. And we're going to show the results here momentarily. So choose one that is most applicable. Not yet analyzing data for team, sources internal to my hospital system, data provided by CMS or other models like MSSP, CJR, information derived from Medicare claims data, or other sources of data. And just out of curiosity, if it is other sources of data, if you want to drop that into the little question module, curious to if there's anything that we didn't get on here, be curious to see where you're getting that data from as well. Okay, I think most of the results have come in. So we're going to close it down in another 5 long seconds here. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And I'm going to go ahead and show the results. Okay, Alyssa and John, are you able to see the results on your screen?
Yes, I can see the results. So it looks like we have three of the options are somewhat clustered, with the most frequently reported being information derived from Medicare claims data. That's a good sign, 30% of respondents. And then we have a tie at 25% for attendees not yet analyzing data for team or utilizing sources that are internal to their hospital or system, and 18% using data that's been provided by CMS for other models that they're already participating in. And I think that ties in really nicely into sort of what are the sources to consider. So you'll see, the options here are very closely tied to that polling question. And I would say, there's no right or wrong answer, but each data source will carry different advantages and also disadvantages to consider. Um, Internal information is definitely ranks high as far as accessibility. It's very good for ascertaining, what are those estimated volumes that your hospital can anticipate. But the one downside would be is that you may have some gaps across the care continuum if you're starting to think of where else are your attributed patients receiving care throughout the episode. You can also think of, what type of information is in health information exchange. The downside being there is that the HIEs are primarily focused on clinical data, though some are starting to incorporate claims. One other downside here is that there can be issues with data quality and usability from the exchanges. You'll see there are vendors that are purchasing and bringing in data that's really vast from claims clearinghouses. This type of data is really good for when you're looking at things that are more from an all-payer approach, but usually comes at a high cost and some limited granularity, depending on the type of analysis that you want to do. The two sources listed on the bottom are really probably your best bet going into team. So one is, looking at CMS files from other models that your organization might already be at risk for. So, it can give you good representation across the continuum of care. So if you think of if your hospital also happens to be aligned with an accountable care organization, or maybe you were already at risk in a model like the Comprehensive Care for Joint Replacement model or PPCI Advanced, there's likely to be overlap. The one place where those files can fall short is if you have differing attribution methodologies or also differing lengths of time at risk, which again can create gaps. So definitely still a good source of information, but can also have those challenges depending on how well your population is going to line up between those programs and team. And then the last option, which is what we use at DataGen, is looking at other Medicare files that can be acquired that are really used for more research purposes. And these often are referred to as RAF files, which are research identifiable files, or limited data set files. And even the choice of RAF or LDS data carries with it different limitations, advantages, and disadvantages. But these are really, I would say, would be the preferred source when it comes to, that coverage across the continuum of care and also being able to cut very specific populations for doing this type of episodic analysis. So at this point, we're going to start talking about a lot of the data and the trends that we see in these episodes, and I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, John.
All right. Thank you, Alyssa. So I will be going through DataGen's methodology and interesting high-level facts for each bundle. Just to note, I have to go through 40 slides in about 20 minutes, so some of the upcoming data slides will be covered very briefly. They're primarily to be included for reference rather than detailed discussions, or there's no real very interesting facts in them. So getting into the methodology. So DataGen, we're using the Medicare Standard Analytic File Limited Data Set. This data has 100% of inpatient, outpatient, home health, skilled nursing facility, and hospice. These settings make up the majority of episode cost. The limited data set does have a 5% beneficiary statistical sample for the professional and DME claims. We do an extrapolation of these settings for episodes of cost for beneficiaries outside of the sample to make up the difference. We recreate the team bundles based on the team rule that came out, as well as leveraging our experience with other bundles such as CJR and BPCIA. All the data presented is in calendar year 2023. For payments, we create a standard payment or neutral payment based on the ResDAC standard payment methodology, which is used in bundles. In addition, we prorate the payments for claims spanning outside the 30-day window. And at the episode level, when we compare it to a goal, we Winsorize at the 99th percentile. Talking about the goal, we create a pseudo team target based on the regional average episode spending with the team discount factor applied, the 1.5 or 2%, as well as we include a provider bed size adjustment. And lastly, for this presentation, we're following the CMS cell size suppression policy. On the next slide, we see a reference to which states fall into which census region. So when we talk about regions, we're talking about the US Census region. You can take a moment to find your state and see what region you fall into. A lot of our analysis will be split out by these regions. So moving into the meat of the presentation. So episode category distribution. As Alyssa kind of mentioned before, we can easily see the majority of episodes in team are lower joint replacements at 58%. This makes team, in my opinion, kind of like an extension of CJR with four extra bundles thrown on top of it. And especially since the methodology is very close to CJR as well. If you combine lower joints half of spinal fusions, which I'll talk about later, and shift, about 80% of team, is around the orthopedic specialty. We'll be presenting the data from most frequent to least frequent data. And on the right-hand side, you see the interquartile ranges, which is the 25th and 75th percentile of the percent of providers for using that bundle. This kind of shows how the top 3 bundle percentages ranges among team providers. All right, getting into our first bundle, lower joint replacements. So the first major point to make here about joint replacements is site neutral target. We see on the left-hand side a target code. This illustrates that site neutral target of itself. Site neutral target meaning inpatient and outpatient episodes of the same surgery have the same target. In other words, an outpatient knee will have the same target as an inpatient knee. This is important specifically for target code 470 because the regional percentage of outpatient procedures will influence the target as well as providers' performance in the model. Given that the anchor outpatient procedure payments, standard payments, are about $1,200 less than inpatient anchor stay payments, meaning if you have an outpatient procedure episode, that episode's already at the anchor stay $1,200 less than an inpatient episode. On the next slide, we see that 87% of lower joint episodes are the 470 hip and knee procedures. Out of those 470 target codes, almost 80% are the outpatient hip and knees, and majority of that is actually knees. Combining the fact that 58% of all of team episodes are in lower joints, 50% of all team episodes, period, are the 470 procedures. So reiterating that 470 inpatient, outpatient, knees and hips make up the majority of team, half of team altogether. So on the next slide, we see our first regional variation, giving you the main colors to look at. We have the dark blue bars at the bottom. That's your anchor stay, which is basically your DRG or outpatient payment. The little red that you see, that's the readmissions payments. Light blue is inpatient rehab. Green is skilled nursing facility or SNF. Yellow is home health. Those are the main post-acute care that we can see here. So we see somewhat regional variation for skilled nursing and home health. And we look at the next slide, we see the similar regional variation looking at the first post-acute care setting after the anchor stay. Now, it's important to note the use of self-care here. The self-care definition for what we have is basically the absence of use in the 30-day bundle of home health care, skilled nursing facilities, inpatient rehab, or other post-acute care. Basically, these patients go home with outpatient or office-based PT or physician follow-up. Looking at the regions, the lowest region, New England, has about 10% self-care, and then Mountain West North Central has 60% of self-care. On the next slide, we see a little bit different graph of the same information, but showing the top regional providers. Those top providers use more self-care than the team providers. This is a trend in general for lower joints. For us doing work way back in BPCI Classic all the way to today with CJR and even looking at team. 10 years ago, providers have been moving from inpatient rehab to SNF or reducing SNF length of stay or moving from SNF to home health. Now it's more of a move from home health to this outpatient or office-based PT. And we can see that with the top providers having more self-care than the general team regions and team. On the next slide, we see the potential financial gain or loss by each provider. Each bar represents a team provider. The graph shows it's skewed a little bit to the right, meaning more team providers are at a financial loss. kind of again to note that providers have been working on lower joints for over 10 years, starting back in BPCI Classic. So this bundle makes it a little bit harder to make savings, since a lot of that low-hanging fruit of reducing SNF length of stay or moving from like inpatient rehab to SNF is kind of pretty much gone at this point. And then on the next slide, we see the variation between regions of percentage of team providers who have already reached that potential financial gain in teams for lower joints. Basically, the Mid-Atlantic, New England, and West South Central have only about 20% of team providers with positive financial outcome. That's just more or less due to the random sampling for the CBSAs in the beginning of teams. Moving along to spinal fusion. This category also has outpatient episodes, which means we have that target code and a site neutral code. And you can see the different bundlings here. A little bit about the new DRGs in spine, and we'll talk more about it later. But kind of very simply put, CMS broke out the 5 previous DRGs, took the 5 previous DRGs and made them to 10, so made it more granular, and they split it out based on, in general, single versus multi-level, and then combine anterior and posterior versus single approaches. And we can see we color code the targets, or color code the DRG bases or triplets, however you want to call it, for ease of use. And I'm going to go to the next slide. And here's the other codes for spinal fusion. And then if we go into the code distribution, we see this is the most spread out among all the bundles. Also, we have the most DRGs and HCPCS codes in this bundle. So kind of just to note, for 2023, we mapped the old DRGs to the new DRGs, basically by tricking the CMS grouper, but so that we had some sort of information about these new DRGs. If we kind of combine certain groups of DRGs, we can see single level fusions except cervical is about 35%, which is 402 and 452. Neck spinal fusion is about 30%. That's the 473 and 472 target codes. And on the right-hand side, you see that the 3 target codes with the outpatient and with the percentages of outpatient episodes are in those target codes. So on the next slide, again, we see the regional variation. The variation is primarily due to DRG case mix or higher inpatient anchor outlier payments. That's that lower blue bar at the bottom. The post-acute care spending is relatively the same. Looking at FPAC, we see some variation in SNF and home health use. Inpatient rehab is relatively constant across the regions, which is interesting. And on the next slide, we see the spinal fusion providers, financial gain or loss, and we see skew to the right, having more providers at a loss than a gain. And then looking at the variation between regions, the percentage of providers with a positive financial gain. So veering off a bit, as I mentioned before, we'll talk about the old DRGs to the new DRGs. So we did this analysis for all of the US for all IPPS hospitals. So on this slide, we see the old DRGs and what percentage of claims get mapped to the new DRGs. One interesting tidbit on this to point out is that DRGs being mapped to 402, that DRG has a lower weight than other DRGs, meaning that it's paid less, because that's how the inpatient payment rule works with the weights. This means specifically for like 453, the 402 anchor payment is $30,000 less, $30,000 less. For 454, it's about $13,000 less, and 455, it's about $5,000 less. Just kind of get a sense of that episode spending, that change. And then lastly, to touch upon a fact of spinal procedures is that In general, it's a split between orthopedic surgery department and neurosurgery departments. If you look at the whole bundle across all team providers, it's like a 50-50 split. But for specifically the single level fusions except neck, it's slightly more orthopedic based, whereas the neck spinal fusions is more neurosurgery based, which that kind of makes sense logically. So yeah, that's it for spine. Moving right along. Now to shift, surgical hip fractures femur treatment. As you can see here, these are the 3 DRG codes. Nothing special like spine, or there's no outpatient here, so it's a straight DRG codes. The next slide illustrates the one important point with shift is that patients are older and may not be eligible for a joint replacement. About 75% of this bundle have patients above 75 or 75 or older, whereas compared to like lower joints, the 75 and older population is only about 40%. So we're dealing with a lot older population. And if we go to the next slide, there's no surprise for DRG variation because it's an older population. If you combine the green and the yellow, which is 481 and 480, about 85% of patients have a non-major or major complication or comorbidity. On the next slide, we see again the regional variation in SNF and inpatient rehab use. Interestingly, we do see some SNF swing bed use in certain regions. SNF swing bed, and that's that darker green color, and we see that at the top. Those SNF swing beds are about 5 times more costly than a SNF. It is basically an inpatient stay when they use a SNF cost swing bed. So, for these patient population, obviously, if it's possible to shift them out of a SNF cost swing bed, that would be cost saving. The same thing, moving appropriate patients from inpatient rehab to SNF would also show some cost savings for shift. Going to the next slide, first post-acute care setting, we see the same type of similar variation as we previously saw with the SNF and inpatient rehab, that use across different regions. And then on the next slide, the provider financial gain or loss. Again, slightly skewed to the right, more providers at a loss than gain. And then again, on the next slide, just kind of the variation across different regions for shift. Okay, on to major bowel. And again, nothing really interesting with the codes, 3 codes, CC, MCC, and without MCC. We see the distribution. About 80% of patients have a non-major or major complication or comorbidity. That's again adding the green and the yellow together. To note, for the first interesting point of bowel, about 45% of patients in bowel have a cancer diagnosis, either as a primary or secondary. So just keep that in mind. I'll go touch that again later on. So moving on, looking at the variation between regions, really not much variation in the sense of overall cost. There's about a $3,000 difference between the most expensive, which is Mid-Atlantic, and the least expensive is New England. And the post-acute care, maybe a little bit of variation in inpatient rehab use, that blue bar. And we go to the next graph, the FPAC graph, kind of shows that same slight variation across the post-acute care spectrum. Now, going on the next slide is going into my second interesting point about bowel, is that non-elective episodes are significantly more expensive than elective bowel episodes. So if we look at just DRG 330, that's the middle 2 bars, that is the most frequent DRG in the bundle. And the non-elective procedures are about 20% higher than the elective procedures. So I'm going to go on a small tangent here, and I'll preface this with that I do have a biostats degree, so I found this very interesting, and it warms my heart to talk about confounding and a little bit of Simpson's paradox, if anyone remembers that. So when we were looking at this bundle and we were stratifying just by cancer and DRG, so we'll look at DRG 330, and we stratified just by cancer. We saw that cancer patients were less expensive than non-cancer patients, and that kind of did not make sense. When we looked further into it, we saw that cancer patients have a lower percentage of non-elective surgeries compared to non-cancer patients. And as you see here, non-elective surgeries are way more expensive, meaning that non-cancer patients having a more percentage of them would be more expensive. So one thing that we came up with, a logical assumption, is that cancer patients have less non-elective surgery, more or less because they have more touch points with providers or they're followed more closely than non-cancer patients. Also, a side note, non-elective bowel procedures, from our understanding, are more complicated. Potentially, patients can't do like bowel prep, and that may cause complications, etc. And just to note, once you do stratify on cancer and elective status, cancer patients are more slightly expensive, which kind of makes sense at that point. So yeah, that was a nice little tangent there of the confounding factor of elective and non-elective. So now going back into our normal slides, we see again slight skew to the right, but this is probably the closest we see as a 50-50 split. And this type of graph, we'll see a similar looking graph in cabbage. When we see it coming up, it's almost a 50-50 split of positive gain and losses. And then interesting on the last one, again, variation across region. Here, we actually don't see much variation. It's around 40 to 50% across different regions. So that was kind of interesting. This is the least variation across all the different regions. Lastly, we have cabbage. Cabbage for the DRGs, there's 6 DRGs, but really 3 different types of groups. We have the PTCA, which the 231 and 232, as you're going to see in the next graph, they're 2%. They're very, very small percentage. 233 and 234, that's cabbage with catheterization. And then the last 2 are cabbage without the cardiac catheterization. And just keep in mind, remember, cabbage is the lowest volume episode category. There's only 5%, only makes up TEAM by 5%. Here we see the distribution. Majority of cabbage is about 60% are the cabbage without catheterization. That's the green and the yellow, the 235 and 236. Just kind of to note, the 234 and 235, that's the blue and the purple, they do include open ablations. And those for 234 and 235, about 10% of those cases have an open ablation. Just to kind of make that aware that having a cabbage and an open ablation does occur in this bundle. That percentage of 10% probably varies across different providers. So that's just kind of to note that. On the next slide, the post-acute care, we see not too much variation. West South Central has a lot more inpatient rehab use than other regions. New England Pacific seem to have higher DRG case mix or higher inpatient outlier payment than other regions. On the next graph, the FPAC graph kind of shows, again, the similar pattern of the inpatient rehab use and the variation, home health, a little bit in self-care across the different regions. And then on the next graph, as mentioned previously, this graph kind of shows, again, about the same as bowel, a 50-50 split. And then lastly, we can see the variation of positive providers between regions, with Mountain having the highest at 67%. And then that is all that I have. And I will pass it back to Alyssa to discuss what is next for team.
Thank you, John. So before we wrap up for this session, I just want to cover some of the considerations or things to think about as we get closer to when team will be going live. So the first thing on my list is just really noting some of the ambiguity in the safety net status calculation that CMS is going to be using for team. So for a hospital to be considered a safety net hospital, CMS is going to be looking primarily at two factors, and it's an or. You can either be you can either serve beneficiaries above the 75th percentile in terms of Part D, the Part D low income drug subsidy, or based on dual eligibility status. And what's notable about this criteria is that we find that Medicare uses different criteria for determining safety nets in this program versus other guidance and use in other programs, even in CMMI's own strategy refresh documentation. The definition that's used in the rule is kind of poorly written, so it's hard to tell, what is CMS counting? Are they counting people? Are they counting claims? We have received confirmation on a number of the factors that we had concerns about. For example, they're looking at the distribution of all IPPS hospitals, excluding Maryland. They're also looking at the population served in both the inpatient as well as the outpatient setting, especially because team does involve episodes that can be triggered in both settings. One thing to note is that CMS does have plans to publish the list of the hospitals that will have this safety net status classification. It will eventually be published with the list of hospitals that are participating in the program. So likely later this year we'll know. And that classification of safety net status is so important because a hospital that meets that definition of being a safety net provider will have additional risk adjustment based on that factor, and they also have the option to stay in track 1 with no downside risk for the first 3 years of the program. The next consideration is that low volume thresholds have not been set yet. Right now, there isn't a low volume threshold policy. There was a policy that was proposed initially, and that was going to be that a hospital needed to have at least 31 episodes across all 5 episode categories and the 3-year baseline period. That was a really low and harsh low volume threshold policy, and a lot of industry stakeholders pushed against that rule. So when the last final rule came out, CMS basically said, we'll take it into consideration, and they pushed it out for this rulemaking season. So that is something that we're hoping to see resolution for. There usually is some threshold for low volume if you look to past models like the BPCI and BPCIA programs, or also in CJR. And the reason why it's so important is because if you're a provider with low volume, your results can have a lot of wide variation. So not only does it make your reconciliations unpredictable, but that's also going to mask the effects of real clinical change. And you'll see that different episodes also will have inherently different amounts of cost variability as well. So that's why it's such an important issue for this program. The next aspect is that the target price methodology, though most of it is fleshed out, it's not yet final. Again, waiting for that next proposed rule, primarily to see what CMS decides will be the HCC look back period, where they had a couple of different windows ranging from 90 days to 180 days that they might look back at to see what a patient's comorbidities are for that extra level of risk adjustment. And then the other thing that's really an unknown, especially under the new leadership of HHS and CMS, is, what part of the risk adjustment methodology might be removed from consideration. For example, there's consideration for beneficiary social risk. Is that something that's going to be taken out of the program? We just don't know yet. Um, the next big milestone for TEAM is really going to be publication of the inpatient prospective payment system fiscal year 2026 proposed rule. The rule has been sitting in OMB since mid-February for review. Usually we see this published sometime around mid-April, might have some delays to it just based on other things that have been delayed by the government, but at least we know it's in OMB and has been there for over a month. So things are lining up as expected there. Some people on today may have seen there is a RFK Junior policy that was recently published at the beginning of March, which intends to limit the public's role in the rulemaking process. This is something that was very concerning to us, not knowing how this could potentially impact the Medicare program or anybody's ability to comment on payment system rules. But at least the good news of what we're seeing and interpretation has been that, at least for Medicare, we don't see this as something that's going to impact the standard rulemaking process, and that CMS is still bound to follow the rulemaking requirements unless there is specific action taken by Congress to exempt a rule from having that public notice and comment period. The last thing I'll just note is a couple of months ago, for the comprehensive care for joint replacements model, we had the first evaluation of CJR's extension period. That's what's referred to as performance year 6 in that program. The reason why that evaluation is so important is that the entire target price methodology of TEAM is based off of what CMS implemented for CJR's 3-year extension. And the big finding out of this evaluation was that CJR had over $54 million in savings to Medicare in that first year of the extension period. While there were savings to Medicare, there was no impact on quality, but that is still considered a successful model in CMS's rules for what can justify expansion of a model. So at least that was a good signal from CJR for why we think TEAM would still be going forward, especially given that lower extremity joint replacements are the highest volume episode that's even going to be involved in TEAM. Just want to note, DataGen has 2 services for hospitals that will be going at risk in the TEAM model. One is our opportunity analysis, where hospitals can get a sense of where they stand now using that data that John used throughout our presentation. If your hospital hasn't begun looking at into your data and how your performance may be, this might be something that's useful for you. And our other service is our team performance monitoring service, which is really for when hospitals are at risk. So that involves processing your monthly files from CMS, validating reconciliation results and possible contestations, and also that one-on-one data support and convening our customers for that shared learning opportunity. So at this point, we're going to transition from the formal presentation into the Q&A session. And I see Garrett's coming on for this part.
All right, great. And we do have a number of audience questions today, so we're going to try to get to as many as we can. If we don't get to yours for some reason, don't worry, someone will reach out to answer your question via email afterwards. So without further ado, let's dive in here. First question is this: is my target price going to be based on my CBSA or a different region?
So this is one of those things that when regions are referred to throughout the rule can frequently be confused. So for hospitals, it's your CBSA that got you into TEAM and is what made your hospital have a mandatory participation status, but it is your census division, one of those 9 U.S. census divisions that are multi-state regions, that will be the basis of your actual target price in TEAM. So you have to consider all of the players in that larger market.
Wonderful. Next question, moving right along. If my hospital starts making clinical changes now, Will those improvements result in a lower team target price to work towards?
So where this is concerning is so different bundled payment models will have a different basis of that target price methodology. And a lot of the past models, especially the voluntary models, were based on a provider's own historical efficiency. And CMS would take, that provider's own historic average as the basis of the target price. Um, that that's not in play for a model like Team, where the target price is entirely regionally set. So really anything that your hospital starts doing now to improve, it is only going to be setting up your hospital for success. There is no aspect of your hospital's own historic efficiency that's going to be part of the equation. And if you think of what your own market share is in comparison to that entire multi-state census region, anything that you do to start changing care now and lowering total Medicare episode spend really isn't going to have a tangible impact on that starting point of your target price.
Wonderful. All right, next question. Uh, are the DRG and HCPCS trigger codes for a target code interpreted as and both or either or?
So it's both of those codes go into the quote unquote target code. So for inpatient, talking again, target code 470, that target has both the 470 DRG plus the two HCPCS codes for outpatient hip and knee. So those averages are combined to create that target code. And that goes back to what I was saying about the outpatient percentages. The more outpatient procedures, that that would be a lower cost in that target, because there's going to be more of those lesser cost anchor stays, plus outpatient procedures tend to be less complicated than your inpatient. So that's, they combine together.
Okay. Next question. Is there any published details for what coding is applied to episode inclusive cases? For example, if a patient has one of the procedures but then is admitted within the 30-day window for the flu, should that be counted as part of the episode?
So they do state the exclusions. The exclusions for readmissions are rare. They're they're trauma, burns, cancer, being admitted for cancer type surgeries or transplants. So they're very rare. If someone gets a flu and gets admitted, and they're there for sepsis or whatever, that admission is included. There's other exclusions in the model, like Part B drugs. Those are based on the average sale price list, and they basically look at the similar to BPCIA, where very expensive drugs or very rare drugs are excluded, and they update that list. They will update that list every performance period, and that's based on the baseline data. And then I think they also exclude the factor codes for hemophilia, the J factor codes. Is there anything else, Alyssa? I don't think.
Nope, that's it.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. What is the data source for the statistics displayed and for what time period?
For our
For the
presentation,
data,
2023, all of 2023.
Okay,
yep.
yeah, and I think that was what the question was. And the other part of that question was, what is the data source for
Yep.
the?
So this is the Medicare Standard Analytic limited data set files. So DataGen purchases the quarterly files of this data every quarter. And then we re-architect the team episode methodology to trigger every episode in the country. And then that is the basis for the statistics shown throughout the presentation.
Okay. Next question. How do ICD-10 codes come into play in Team, and do you have a comprehensive list of these for the model?
So IC10 doesn't really, I mean, ICD-10 codes go into the Medicare DRG grouper that groups them into those DRGs, which triggers the episode. and
Mhm.
that's the extent. I mean, all those ICD codes are in the publicly available on the CMS website of what codes trigger for what DRG. Um, Primarily, they're the procedure codes, but obviously the diagnosis codes there's a list of what triggers for MCC and CCs, complications or comorbidities, or major complications or comorbidities, which is based on ICD-10 codes.
Great. Uh, Very good. Next question is actually a statement. It says, "Shout out to DataGen for the many years of excellent work in public education." So,
Oh,
uh,
thank you.
kudos to
Awesome.
you guys. And then next question here is, what does site neutrality mean for team target prices?
Site neutral, just a shorthand saying of it doesn't matter if the procedure was done inpatient or outpatient. If you're getting a knee replacement done, you're going to get the same target. So going back to my example, if a, if two patients that are basically twins, exactly the same, and they go, one patient gets their knee done as an outpatient and the other patient gets a knee done as an inpatient, both of those patients will have the same exact target, regardless of anything else. So it's does not consider inpatient or outpatient any different for the targets.
I see. Uh, Next question is kind of a follow-on to the one we just discussed about ICD-10. It says, "I guess the ICD-10 codes could be useful to help determine a probable DRG assignment."
Yes, that's usually done uh, with your like hospital's internal system. I mean, most hospitals have like their own coding
Have
and
like a
everything.
billing and coding department.
Yeah, we are kind of we don't deal with that, but that's like most providers have that. What is the most efficient or what's the most probable DRG? What they get billed? Obviously, you send that bill to Medicare. Medicare will group it and they'll tell you what DRG it is. We see this kind of getting into more of the weeds of like reconciliation. We do see once in a while, providers contesting their own claims and DRGs might get switched, so episodes get dropped or added for billing because the final bill for any of these bundles is the final cut of episodes don't happen until the actual final reconciliation, and things can be tangent or transient. Sorry.
Yep. I'd add the one other place where ICD-10 codes will matter is in the flagging of HCC comorbidities, so the hierarchical condition categories, which is part of the risk adjustment methodology. And that's really going to depend on, you know, the codes that get documented for the patient when they're at their, for example, their primary care visits, their office visits for capturing those HCCs. It's one of the tricky things about team compared to like if you're thinking of a traditional ACO, like if this was an ACO model, you look at the prior years or the year before that's claims data of all of the visits to come up with, okay, here were all the flags that were turned on, and here's a risk score, and now we can adjust for it. But for team, Medicare won't be looking at an entire year's time. So and we don't yet know what that window will be, but it's definitely going to be short. So it's going to be those visits really preceding the admission that will matter for what HCC's CMS is looking at for the purposes of how it impacts a team episode.
Let's see. Great. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. We are at the top of the hour, and if we did not get to your question, don't worry. Again, someone will reach out to make sure that we answer yours. But I wanted to thank you, John. Thank you, Alyssa, for a fantastic presentation. We will be sending out a link to the presentation, and so you can see that recorded, and as well as get the slides. So if you want to review it and again share it with colleagues, you'll be able to do that. But as we close out, I wanted to encourage you all to head over to vbcexhibithall.com and check out the virtual exhibit booth that DataGen has there. And there's is a great place to read up on them and kind of see what they're doing in the space. There's a lot of resources there and information. And of course, you'll be able to reach out and contact them directly through there. This is also at vbcexhibithall.com is where we'll be archiving this recording in our library, along with other webinars that both DataGen and other organizations have done on a huge variety of topics. So head on over there and take a look around. And again, there will be a link in these slides to get there. And then finally, if you'd like to reach out to the DataGen team directly and to either of our speakers, Alyssa's and John's information is here on the screen. And again, this will be included in the slides that we send out. So wanted to thank you all so much for spending your afternoon with us. Hope you have a wonderful rest of the week and that you join us for the next one. Until then, take care.